mine, but I'm here to introduce Joshua, and we are here to listen to him to talk about his book, because as we all know, this is the occasion on which his book's being launched here in London. So Josh, you're very happy. I was about to say prepared, but I think happy to take questions at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to you to take us forward. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to my and our gracious hosts here at the Royal Asiatic Society, and thanks so much all of you for being here. I was joking before this that the setting is a little bit too on the nose. I'm flanked here by H.T. Coldbrook, who was, before he founded the RAS, a member prominently of the East India Company, as well as quite often a critic of the East India Company. And this theme of the relation between the politics of the company and scholarship, including that carried out by the RAS, is really at the heart of the book I'm going to tell you a bit more about. So I'm going to try to cover this whole book in a pretty short lecture of about half an hour and take questions afterward. I'm going to kind of introduce the book and its argument, some of the interventions I hope that it makes in the scholarship on the company. This is the part I'm going to really try to be quick about, give a preview of the chapters, and finish with a conclusion gesturing at how this history might still be relevant in some ways today. How, in fact, the politics of a company and company state still has something to teach us in a moment of relations among states, global corporations, and knowledge being contested and remade. This moment is not so different from that of the late 18th and early 19th century, at least in that respect. But I want to start with a quote, the one that first brought me to this subject 10 years ago in 2013, when I was a lowly graduate student searching desperately for a dissertation topic, a feeling that probably many in the room can relate to. Commerce may be rendered subservient to the promotion of science, and the same ship that carries the East India Company's orders to Calcutta may likewise carry the new instruments or the new work, and may bring back the Indian book for the student of Göttingen or the professor of Oriental languages at Paris. Jacques-Pierre Brissot wrote these words in 1783, and as soon as I saw them, I started asking a whole set of questions. Why at this moment, when the East India Company was conquering and ruling vast swaths of South Asia, was Brissot portraying it in these kind of mercantile terms? Mercantile, despite this company becoming much more than a trading company at this time. Moreover, at a time when the company was being roundly criticized in Britain and in South Asia for the violence of that process of conquest and its extraction of profits. Why at such a time was someone like Brissot, a man of the Enlightenment by all accounts, why was he portraying it as an enlightened benefactor? I started thinking about these issues, and they led me to the topic of the book. To answer these questions, I'd have to revisit the company's ideology, its hybrid commercial and political constitution and character, and finally, its engagements with knowledge. How could he make such a claim as this? I soon realized that actually Brissot was not saying anything very original. In the words of Robert Darnton, he was kind of a Grub Street hack, echoing ideas coming from both sides of the English Channel. He was actually echoing here ideas being promulgated and circulated by advocates of the East India Company since the 1770s, and ideas that would continue to be promulgated and circulated for the next 6 decades. The company is remembered today as the world's most powerful corporation. I'm quoting Tirthankar Roy there, and similar quotes by many others could be found. Advocates at the time, however, claimed that it was also the world's most enlightened company. We may not believe this claim for the reasons I just alluded to. The company was notorious even in its own day for violence and profit-seeking on a global scale. And yet I suggest if we dismiss it as simply incidental or instrumental, we miss the importance of knowledge to the company's ideology. So we should take these claims seriously, at least at an ideological level. The commitment to the cause of knowledge was in fact central to the company's ideology in this later period. So to give a little bit of an introduction to the East India Company, some of you won't need this at all, others may find it helpful. This was a chartered company founded in 1600, but by the mid-18th century, it was evolving into a large-scale territorial ruler across India. First with the conquest of the province of Bengal, and then outward and outward until much of South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia were under the rule of the company, directly and sometimes indirectly. The company gave birth to the British Raj. And yet, as this process took off in the later decades of the 18th century, the company struggled to justify its hybrid character as still a merchant as well as a state, a company state, in the words of Phil Stern. How did it justify this hybrid character? A question that's beginning to be asked by historians more now that we understand that dual character better in recent decades. My answer is that it turned in part to ideas about knowledge, to legitimize this dual character as a company and state, even at a time when it's becoming this massive territorial ruler. So how did knowledge fit in? How did knowledge help with legitimization? The East India Company had long sponsored learning. There's work on the company doing so in the 17th century, almost from its beginnings. But from the 1770s, this sponsorship really took on a new ideological aspect. It was much more politically valuable. And the pioneer in this regard was the first Governor General of Bengal in Eastern India, the beginning point of the company's expansion. Hastings developed what he called a system of conciliation. What the system meant was that he could buttress the company state at this moment of criticism, at this moment when it seemed under threat from power holders in India, political classes there, as well as the government and political classes back in Britain. It could buttress the company state by patronizing European scholar officials, company men who had become interested in scholarship, and Indian learned elites, Malvis and pundits, who you'll hear more about, who were themselves engaged in scholarship that the company could use for its political purposes. I'll tell you more about this idea of conciliation. For now, suffice it to say, this was an idea that befitted merchant and sovereign. It was denoted a commercial style of politics based on negotiation and accommodation. It was also an idea rooted in both British and Indian political thought. And it was a mainstay of the company's ideology, a cornerstone even of that ideology for much of the next 6 decades. This idea survived Hastings' impeachment, something many of you may have heard about. After he returns back to Britain, he's impeached in Parliament. The idea survives. It's used by him at trial to defend himself. It survives the pressure of the 1780s and 90s in Britain, when the company is coming under a lot of criticism. It even survives a later challenge by the Governor General, Richard Wellesley, brother of the Duke of Wellington, and Governor General of Bengal in the turn of the 19th century. Yet the biggest challenge to this idea comes from the company's own evolution. The dwindling of its trade, it being given up to competitors and curtailed by Parliament, and the expansion of its territory. It's losing its trade and growing in its territorial footprint in this time. New demands are made on the company as a result. Rather than conciliate elites, it starts to see the benefit of convincing publics of its good government. Conciliation, this idea, is finally eclipsed in the 1830s by a new idea of mass education. And I hasten to add that no system of mass education is really implemented at this time. It remains at an ideological level, as an idea, more than a concrete practice. So if that's the book in a nutshell, at least its main argument, tracing how the company uses ideas about knowledge in different ways over 6 or 7 decades. Well, what interventions am I making here? Why tell such a story? Who am I responding to? I see this book as an intervention in a relatively new field called the history of knowledge. But this history of knowledge has not really been concerned with ideas, surprisingly. You would think that if knowledge is power, as the aphorism goes, then knowledge would also be political. Yet, actually, we haven't really studied knowledge debates in the terms in which they were waged. Similarly, this is an intervention in the history of ideas, or intellectual history, and particularly the history of political thought. But historians in this field have not been so concerned with knowledge as an analytical category. So what I put forward as the method of this book, and a method that can be deployed in other contexts, is a history of ideas of knowledge. Tracing different meanings of knowledge over time would be one approach. My approach in this book is to trace how ideas of or about knowledge were used, deployed, and changed in the context of political argument. So it's both a history of knowledge and a history of political thought. Now, I think this intervention is particularly relevant and important when it comes to the history of the British Empire in South Asia. This history has covered the East India Company and its entanglements with knowledge in 3 different main ways. From about the late 1960s, the dominant interpretation was that of David Kopf, who wrote about a clash between Orientalist or eastward-facing and Anglicist or westward-facing cultural formations. It's an early cultural history. Really, he anticipates the cultural turn that comes in the 1970s. And this was incredibly influential. It continues to be rehashed by other historians and with slight variations. But by the 1980s, you really see the influence of Edward Said. A whole new range of scholars researches and writes about what they call colonial knowledge, very much taking on board this idea that embedded in the knowledge of the company is domination. The leading scholar of this in India is Bernard Cohn, an anthropologist who is taking Said's ideas really and deploying them in the South Asian context. By the 1990s, you get a third approach. Besides this cultural history of Kopf and this colonial knowledge approach of Said and Cohn and others. You get the work of Chris Bailey on information and intelligence. This too, I would argue, is really studying cultures and structures of knowledge rather than ideas about knowledge. And all 3 of these cases, these are great historians and great books, but they have their limitations. And I would argue that the main one is they're concerned with cultures and structures of knowledge rather than actual debates around knowledge and the terms that those debates were had. So I propose to study those knowledge debates involving the company in their own terms. How did people talk about knowledge? How was it different from things like information and intelligence? How did they, historical actors, see the value of knowledge in political terms? Actually, they had very sophisticated ways of talking about these things. Not only modern scholars who can do this. People at the time were talking about the politics of knowledge. It's a trendy new phrase, perhaps, but it has deep historical roots. And that's why it has benefit for us today. Even those of us who aren't particular specialists in this topic or this field, don't even know much about it, I think, might appreciate that we now are in a moment kind of similar. A moment when corporations are encroaching on many of the knowledge domains long claimed by states. The world of publishing, for instance, medical or scientific research, universities, libraries. These are places that we now see corporate power encroaching, challenging the long dominant role of states. And yet there's a history to this. This is not perhaps actually all that new. There's a long history of companies doing many of these things, although we tend to forget that. So recovering that history, I suggest, we might in fact recover resources that we can use in debates in the present around the relations among companies, states, and knowledge. I'll get back to this point about the sort of present day implications at the end, but I want to end my introduction with that sort of suggestion that we don't want to draw too close a connection between the modern multinationals of today and the East India Company. They were different beasts. However, there are certain things to be learned from those earlier knowledge debates because they raise a lot of the same issues we find ourselves confronting today. I'm going to talk briefly about the chapters of this book. And here's where I think will try to rein myself in and not deluge you with details. I'm going to stick to the main points here, or try to, and you can please ask me more about them when I get to the Q&A. I can go on and on about it, so I'm happy to. As I suggested in the introduction, this story really starts with Warren Hastings in the 1770s. Hastings, in the words of Samuel Johnson, a correspondent, was something new, a governor who patronizes learning. And he really was something new. He patronized knowledge on a new scale. His predecessors had done nothing like these massive projects that he inaugurated, which ranged from compiling and translating Hindu and Islamic law codes, founding colleges, the Calcutta Madrasa, and at least trying to start a Hindu college in Benares, and sending 2 missions to Tibet and Bhutan, just to name the most prominent examples of his scholarly patronage. All of this was a response, I argue, to criticism at the time, to people in both Britain and India, Europeans and South Asians, arguing that the company could not rule or should not rule vast territories. This was a time when the company was not only expanding, but taking on a more direct role in governance. And all of this patronage of knowledge was part of what Hastings called a system of conciliation. He uses this phrase. Conciliation, as I started to say in the introduction, was an idea that referred to a commercial mode of politics. Hastings is actually getting this idea fairly directly from his later critic, Edmund Burke, who talks about how commercial states, even the most despotic states at this time, are forced to truck and huckster, to barter. And Hastings takes that on board. He's in a weak position. He has to negotiate for power. There's a commercial aspect to that. Conciliation is also rooted in Indian and British political thought. On the Indian side, there's a history of what's called Sulikul, or universal toleration. It's the usual translation. Actually, it refers to the same sort of idea in general terms of accommodation between or among different groups. And there are South Asian scholars writing about this and updating it and talking about it in connection with scholarship in Hastings' time. So how does the system actually work? If I had to put it in concrete terms. Well, Hastings says the company needs to patronize scholar officials from its own ranks and learned elites in Indian society, people who can influence the political classes on both sides of its operations. This is going to draw support for the company state, this embattled hybrid entity, and help it make new allies, help it see off the challenges to its new and growing power. Now, notably, this idea does not die out when Hastings returns to Britain in 1785. However, it is challenged in new ways. Pressure is put on this idea of conciliation, of attracting support for the company state through scholarly patronage. This happens in Hastings' impeachment, when his great critic, Edmund Burke, sees his patronage as really corrupt, sees it as a way of embezzling money or doing underhanded things, not really honorable or noble at all, not likely to attract support at all. Another set of scandals involves Hastings' successor, John Macpherson, who's a very interesting character, both a man of the Scottish Enlightenment and widely seen as the most corrupt, underhanded official of his day. Quite interesting that he's both of these things at once. He tries to expand this idea of conciliation, take it even further, more patronage, bigger, more grandiose schemes and visions. But that is undermined by the evidence of his own underhanded dealings. So then we get to Macpherson's successor as Governor General of Bengal, Cornwallis, Lord Cornwallis. Even he, rather than abandon Hastings' idea of conciliation, he simply contracts it, seeks to purify it. Patronage is going to have to be much more officialized, less based on interpersonal relations. It's going to have to be reined in so you can avoid then the appearance of corruption. He finds an ally, interestingly, in Sir William Jones, a name that many in the room will know, an influence on this later Royal Asiatic Society, because he founds an Asiatic society in Bengal, a meeting place for scholars and an ambitious learned society on the model of ones in Europe. Jones had been friends, close collaborators with Hastings and Macpherson. He then signs on to Cornwallis's program, becomes an ally in purifying this picture of company scholarship. And as Hastings is exonerated, as the French Revolution happens and British public opinion lines up in favor of the East India Company, which they had come to see in an earlier moment as corrupt, Hastings and his idea become celebrated. You see a new supervisory body of the East India Company, the Board of Control, pursuing its own scholarly projects. You see a wave of celebration of Hastings and the company for its combination of commerce with scholarship. Little do they know that the next leader of the company in India, Richard Wellesley, is going to pose the greatest challenge yet to the company's dual constitution and to this idea of conciliation that has come to support it. He founds the College of Fort William. Interestingly, a college founded years before the first colleges in London. So it's really quite pioneering, but it's a political project. Its aim is not only to train up the East India Company's civil service, those European officials going out to India. It's also part of his effort to replace the commercial sovereignty of the company with a kingly territorial sovereignty. What I mean here is Wellesley sets himself up as a kind of kingly ruler, undermines the commercially oriented directors back in Britain, and uses this college and the symbols of the college to do so. The college befits an expanding territorial empire, one that Wellesley is actively growing through his conquests in West and South India. Rather than conciliate, something that merchants and sovereigns can do, something that speaks to that commercial sovereignty of the company, Wellesley wants to project might and splendor with the college. He holds these grandiose disputations, bringing people from the wider region, all of the kind of European gentlemen and learned Asian scholars of Calcutta and beyond. An ambassador from Baghdad comes to one of the early disputations. Malay scribes are coming from Southeast Asia. And this display of the learning of the students is really a means of displaying the power of his new political formation, the power of him as a ruler and of a company in this new mold as territorial sovereigns. This is a big threat to the directors, who Wellesley is consistently undermining. They recall Wellesley successfully by 1805, reduced the college, cut its funding, cut a lot of the lavish spectacle that Wellesley had centered as part of the project of the college, and they found their own rival college in Hertfordshire, Haileybury College. The directors now are wary about scholar officials who have been associated with the college in Calcutta, and more broadly of the subversive potential of scholarship. They had lined up behind Hastings' idea of conciliation, his patronage of scholar officials. Now they're wary about the politics of knowledge. And so by the later period of the company, in the 1805 to 20 period, you see this initial challenge of Wellesley not going away, but being recycled in new ways. Ideas about knowledge continue to feature in challenges to the company state, and the directors continue to lose their faith in the value politically of knowledge. In the Charter Act of 1813, which is famous for one thing because it introduces missionaries to India. It's famous also in reducing the company's monopoly on trade to China. Previously, they'd had a monopoly over India. Another thing it does is tie the patronage of scholars to the collection of land revenue, suggesting that it's not the company as merchant and sovereign, but it's only the company as sovereign that's responsible for knowledge. Something, again, the directors resist. This measure is introduced, in fact, by a returned company servant in Britain. A second thing that happens at this time is a new breed of ambitious scholar officials, many of them trained at Wellesley's institution, many of them with ideas about expanding the empire further and challenging those small-minded mercantile directors back in Britain. They begin to tailor their projects explicitly to territorial expansion. They see gathering knowledge about this huge and expanding empire as really part of assimilating that empire, part of securing it, learning about all of the tracts that have been conquered in the south from Tipu Sultan or in the west from the Marathas. They see really a direct role for knowledge in continued expansion and securing of territory. Again, challenging the director's view back at home that the company is still, in some sense, a company, a trading company. EIC leaders really sour on scholarly patronage by this time. I think it's significant, for instance, that when the Royal Asiatic Society is founded in the early 1820s, it receives only a very begrudging and token donation from the East India Company. Actually, a lot of the company's servants or retired servants back in Britain are its members, and yet the company doesn't take much interest, keeps it at arm's length. And it's really the Royal Asiatic Society that asserts itself as the bridge between Britain and the world of knowledge out in Asia, something that the company itself had done in an earlier generation. And yet company leaders are beginning to take an interest in Indian education. Something new emerging, partly from private efforts of educationists and missionaries by the 1810s. So in the final chapter of my book, I talk about the new politics of Indian education. This emerges from what's called the paramountcy of the East India Company when it sees off its last major rivals, the Marathas, Mysore, and finally reduces the Mughal emperor, the leader of the great Mughal empire, to being a small vassal of the company. As it becomes paramount, at the same time, publics both in Britain and India are demanding more from the company as a governor, demanding good government in this moment of the age of reform getting going by this period. And this is how debates over native education emerge. In Calcutta, the capital of the company's empire in India, in Madras, its capital to the south, and in Bombay, capital in the west. They're even happening in Singapore, a new territory founded at this time. And of course, they're happening back in Britain, as all of these officials come to think about education as a way of demonstrating their good government, keeping the company in power. But as they start to debate education, they come up against this old idea of conciliation in a quite new context. They wonder whether they still need to patronize a small group of elites or whether they can actually hope to engage with a broader public. It's this tussle between the idea of conciliation on the one hand and the idea of mass education or popular education on the other hand, I argue, that's at the heart really of what has been called the Anglicist Orientalist controversy. Many of you may have heard of this. It's taught in most courses on British India. It's a moment in the 1830s that leads to Thomas Babington Macaulay's famous or notorious Minute on Education. And yet, while this has been seen as a debate between English and European knowledge on the one hand and a more kind of sympathetic Eastern-oriented scholarship on the other hand, I argue that that's mainly a sort of superficial layer superimposed on this larger debate between conciliation or mass education. The outcome of this debate in the later 1830s briefly appears to be that English will triumph in companies' education system. The lasting triumph, however, is that of mass education over conciliation in the company's ideology. The company finally dies out in 1858, or at least is reduced to a meaningless corporate charter. The crown takes over control of British India, the empire the company has built. And up till that very last moment, around the time of the final charter it's issued in 1854, you see education being put forward as the company's claim to good government. I hasten to add again here that it never really puts much money into this project of education. It remains at the level of an ideology, something to be done later. But it still is significant in orienting the company's entire philosophy. So as a conclusion, and a way to kind of try to wrap up what I've just said, I want to get back to the point of what we might learn from this history today. Our time, I've suggested already, is also one of corporate involvement with knowledge in a way that seems new to us, and yet, I argue, has a long history. Debates over that involvement also have a long history, as you can see in all the chapters of my book. These are not only about what the company is doing, but what its critics are saying in response, and the debates that ensue across its empire, from London to Calcutta, to the Red Sea, to Tibet, to the Pearl River Delta. So lessons for the present. Companies are not only economic, but also political and ideological in their nature. We tend to forget that. A lot of criticisms of companies today forget that companies have ideologies. Now, this may enable us to make more thoroughgoing critiques of corporate power. But it also allows us to make more effective ones. Companies, because they're political in nature, are, or at least can be made to some extent to be accountable to outside constituencies. Critics of the East India Company tended to have better luck when they held it up to its enlightened promises than when they dismissed those as simply impossible to meet. And at a broader level, beyond suggesting how we might more effectively safeguard the interests of knowledge in this changing landscape today, I think the history of the company gives us a reminder that the state, the company, and knowledge are malleable categories. States have meant many different things, so have companies, and so has knowledge. Rather than find this bewildering, I hope we find it inspiring. The relations among these categories have changed over time. What the company was changed dramatically over time as it outgrew its commercial character. This also means that corporate involvement with knowledge can change. Companies did a lot of the things that we now associate with states in the early modern period, things that we would now call corporate social responsibility, but were actually much bigger at that time, much more integral to what companies did. They were never purely economic actors, and we may see this happening in the future. We should know, indeed, how to debate and think about that. So maybe at the broadest level, I hope that returning to these knowledge debates that the company was involved in shows us that corporate involvement with knowledge can be made to look very different than it does today. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Just turn on the mic.
Oh, was it not on this whole?
No, for the room, don't worry.
Just to say thank you on my part, and also I think on behalf of everyone in the room for such a thorough and enticing introduction and overview to your book. So this is the point where, please, people here today, if you have questions that you'd like to ask Joshua, I see a hand up. So if you want to stand here, Joshua, so that you're in front of the mic, please go ahead.
Terrific talk, excellent, absolutely. I do wonder, given the period between Hastings and, well, the Corby, I suppose, 1837, is there any point at which the company actually believes this? Or is it all nowadays we put down to the director of communications, kind of, giving them a better image, because they know they're bastards, really. We know Wellesley didn't like the orientalist officers and so on. But did they, I mean, was it ever real? Was it just a clock that the company put on it?
Well, I think it's a good question and one that's sort of ultimately unanswerable, and I'll tell you why. I think that real attitudes are hard to ultimately decipher even when you read the historical sources. But what's important about ideology is that once you commit yourself to a position, there's some degree to which you have to meet it in your public behavior. So belief in this sense is not the innermost belief of somebody. It's ideology is a language of politics deployed to legitimate political action. And so that's, I think, true of the company. Once it commits itself to all this sponsorship of knowledge, it's held at least to some extent up to that promise, to varying degrees of success. I mentioned repeatedly that this education scheme never gets off the ground. No money is really sunk into it. And yet things do happen. Colleges are built, books are sponsored, scientific expeditions are carried out for political reasons. So I think many, if I had to guess, I would say many servants of the company never believed what they were doing, used this as window dressing. Others devotedly believed in the scholarship they were carrying out, and maybe the largest number were capable of both positions at once, depending on the moment and the exact thing under discussion and how much money it cost. There was a range of attitudes, but this is the thing about ideology, that once you commit to it, you're held up to it. It binds you to political action in a certain way. I think that's my answer. And I thought about this a lot, so I appreciate your question.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, thanks, Joe. It's great talk, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. Well, I was wondering the way that you framed it around, or there is one of the tensions that seem to emerge is between this West-facing knowledge or European knowledge and local or Asiatic knowledge. Does it mean that we are talking about some sort also of vernacularization of the approach to knowledge, which means that we will see different approaches of the EAC in maybe not in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, even though we might see there with Mackenzie in Madras, not in Bengal, but also between EAC in India versus Hong Kong versus Singapore. So in a way, can we see kind of this thing as a threat to one big corporate of EAC the moment that it lets all these different localized forms of knowledge in different parts of Asia?
A few really interesting threads there, and pardon me if I deal with them somewhat separately and disentangle a few of the things that I think you may want me to bring together. I would say that vernacularization is quite important, and it belies this notion we may have of a simple Anglicist-Orientalist controversy in the 1830s. That controversy, contrary to what you may have read somewhere, it's really only limited to Bengal. There are major variations elsewhere in India and beyond into Southeast Asia. And as I suggested in my kind of chapter summary, what's really at heart still, I think, is this tussle between conciliation and education. The kind of knowledge seems to matter less than how you're going about supporting it, whether you're patronizing a small group of elite scholars or engaging with a broader public, cultivating a broader public through mass education. That's where I think the main argument lies. But I absolutely agree with the second point, which is that the company was not a highly centralized organization. In fact, it was fairly decentralized. Many people were pursuing different interests within it. And that helps us, I think, see what was going on at this time, how policies could be so different in different places and how they could become engaged in debates about the policy to take when it came to knowledge and many other issues besides. So I think that's how I would address your question. Whether forms of knowledge created that decentralization, I think must be true in a much broader sense of the way than I mean of the term knowledge. If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So the very fact of information being so decentralized in the company's operations led to having no capable central control. But that's information, and I'm talking about knowledge. I think that's how I would answer that.
There's a question here, and then maybe one at the back. Yeah.
Just to say again, it's a fascinating talk, and I think very productive approach. Really excited to read the book. What we're looking at here, from what I understand, mainly is what we think of as articulated knowledge. So knowledge which is expressed through language, including Chris' word primarily. One of the themes of 18th century British philosophy was the value of forms of knowledge that were expressed, that were embodied rather than articulated. Famous examples, Adam Smith in economics, with knowledge coordinated with markets or prices, or with Edmund Burke, there's knowledge embodied in customs, manners, traditions, and so on. Does that enter into the kinds of debates that you have encountered, and is that potentially a productive way of sort of understanding some of these issues as well?
I think you raised one among a number of complications with the term knowledge that I had to deal with in the course of working on this project. I came to adopt a pretty wide definition of knowledge, which is anything that people called knowledge at the time. So I don't separate out, I don't draw such a distinction myself, although I'm interested to come across it in the work of people at the time. The only kind of qualification I placed on it is the one I just mentioned to Roy, that I do think I'm limiting myself, and have been with this book, to knowledge in terms of learning or scholarship, and not a synonym of intelligence or information or all of this, which I think takes us away from its ideological import for the company. So I do see this distinction between articulated, embodied, and many other varieties of knowledge being drawn by company servants who themselves are interested in many different branches of knowledge when they go out and pursue them and try to get the company to pay for them. I didn't see it as central to some of the debates I looked at, but no doubt it comes up in much of this work, which is dealing with a variety of languages, a variety of objects that don't come with texts attached, that has to do with science and botany and natural history and the natural world. And so yes, there's all kinds of different knowledge bound up in this category, even though I'd like to draw certain boundaries around it to highlight its ideological character at the time.
Somebody at the back there.
Josh, first of all, really fascinating talk. I really look forward to reading the book. I was just thinking, when you were talking about what the East India Company was doing, and Wellesley in particular, setting up colleges, sponsoring scholars, where would you say draw the comparison? I mean, I'm remembering another article you wrote much earlier on Sultan Tipu of Mysore, or Tipu Sultan, and the fact that he himself was a great man of the arts and philosophy, etc., had a huge library. What would be the major distinction between the way the East India Company was promoting knowledge and education, etc., and the way in which its predecessors, whether they be the Marathas, the Mughals, or Tipu themselves, were doing? Were they just simply congregating scholars within particular madrasas or something, or were they doing something like actually creating colleges that had a bit of more of an appeal beyond just simply a small few?
That's really interesting. Thanks for that question. As in so many other areas of its operations, I think the company was grafting itself onto existing indigenous systems and ideas, and at the same time inevitably changing them. So it is relying on the Mughal revenue system, it's relying on the Mughal legal system and what it imagines to be a Hindu code of laws, sort of constructed at the time out of customary accounts. The same applies when it comes to building libraries or colleges. And this is part of the debate that happens in the 1830s, of course, around whether new kinds of institutions should be built or old ones restored. This is a tension and a not easy one to parse out throughout British rule in India and many other places in the world, right? This tussle between keeping up tradition, inventing tradition, and imposing some new system entirely. I think there's no easy answer to that. But what the company is doing constantly is thinking about that. Thinking about whether what it wants to do is set up something new and impose it, or keep up something old and subtly reinvent it. This is part of the debate around conciliation in the 1830s. It's argued about whether they really want to remake Indian society, or whether what they want to do is keep up the old elite and use them as middlemen to the rest of society. I think that's where I see this come up most clearly in the project, at least in the debates being had by officials, when they argue about this consistently in the 1820s and 30s. So that's where I see it coming up the most, in debates about education, where there's really a tension between keeping up the pundits and Mulvies or doing away with them and creating a new class, a new, much broader class of supporters of the company among the broader public.
Thank you. I come to this as an educationalist more than an orientalist, so I'm particularly interested in the mention of colleges. And I was interested to know how they fitted in to a system, which is basically, like young men, I'm talking young men who wanted a career in India or somewhere else with a company was set there by ambitious parents, or wanted a place like to the serving college where once you got in, you were sent there to learn, and to what extent was it about learning and understanding local culture, or how much was it about, this is what we're doing regardless?
Yeah, well, this is also another kind of live issue for people setting up these institutions. It remains so from the moment they're set up. So you have Richard Wellesley in the College of Fort William in 1800. Soon after, the Court of Directors sets up Haileybury College, a kind of counterpart or replacement for it, really. And then, of course, these are the kind of civil service education institutions. And the curriculum of these is debated, and we have some of the minutes printed or unprinted that contain these debates. And you see all these issues coming up. I think what happens ultimately is, well, the College of Fort William is reduced by the directors. It no longer does much, despite its grand original vision, but just trains civil servants kind of cursorily in a few vernacular languages. This is true, I think, of the quite underfunded College of Fort St. George in Madras, has even less money than the College of Fort William. And meanwhile, it becomes true, sadly, also, I suppose, of Haileybury College, which gives up pretty quickly on its educational mission. The directors become less invested in it, and as they stop seeing the value of training up scholar officials in their ranks, and it starts to become more a place to establish esprit de corps and less one to actually train enlightened civil servants. There's a lot of interesting and kind of lively debates over this among the court of proprietors or shareholders of the company. You see them battling back and forth about the stupidity of training up groceresses and Poopendorfs to go out to India and count bales of hay and measure Muslims. There are amazing quotes like that, getting at the still kind of commercial understanding of some of these shareholders and not understanding why a company that's supposed to be making profits is building big colleges and training up scholars. Yeah.
Okay, we've got some questions lining up. So first in the front, yes, you, and then I'll go to the people behind their hand.
Thank you. A very simple, simplistic model occurs to me that knowledge can be acquired, which of course it was, with increasing enthusiasm as the responsibilities, the scope of activities of the company expanded. Knowledge can be disseminated by teaching, as became of greater and greater interest, as you said, from the 1830s onwards, though much of the best teaching was done after the company closed, or at least lost its influence. But in addition, there's a third arm or leg or aspect to knowledge, which is sharing. And from what little I know, at least in the company, my impression is that
that was where they fell down. They were happy to learn either, if you like, corporately by diktat or individually, but thanks to the enthusiasm of many of its officials. They took late, but reasonably enthusiastically, to disseminating information, but they weren't terribly interested in sharing ideas and information and knowledge with Indian elites, Indian intellectuals, with anybody in India who might say, well, that's a very interesting idea about running the country, but you know, we've never done it that way. Let's see, let's chew this over. Would you agree?
Well, I go always back to the kind of debates that were being had at the time and how people at the time would have conceptualized something akin to knowledge sharing. And as you started saying that, I do find myself remembering moments when it was argued that they should be doing something like knowledge sharing. I mean, I suppose that sharing and dissemination to me don't seem to be entirely different, right? If you're disseminating, then you're sharing.
No, you're not. You're just telling. You're telling a bunch of people in the classroom. A teacher very often can teach a class without ever seeking the opinion of his pupil or her pupils.
Oh, so you mean something reciprocal?
Yeah, sharing is reciprocal, yes, and teaching is not, as by and large, not reciprocal. Yes, answering a few questions perhaps, but not saying, what is your opinion of the policies that we are thinking of introducing, and sharing in that sense. Roundtable discussions, if you like.
Sure. I think again it varies widely. So you have some officials who believe that the knowledge should be reciprocal. It should be gathered as well as disseminated. You have others, educationists, especially kind of missionary ones, who don't believe this at all, who believe that their job is to inculcate Christian principles and that kind of thing.
Sure.
I think you have a wide variety of attitudes. But the success of it, I'm still stuck on the question of whether it was successfully done, because I don't know if it was conceptualized that way. So the ways that knowledge was mainly conceptualized by the company for political purposes was conciliation, which was absolutely reciprocal, and then education, which may or may not have been, depending on how you think of that education. The success of it, I think, is hard to measure. You'd have to think about maybe the long-term impact of all of this knowledge program that the company was engaged in. But I think I leave that to the reader to assess after reading the book.
Thank you.
So I think and then over to Tom.
Thank you very much for your interesting paper. And I think my question is a little bit of a follow-up in terms of the context. So can you say a little bit more about what you think is the position of this particular development within the British Empire? Is it unique just to the EIC, or do they also reflect on the other parts of the empire? And on the other level, you can answer this question too, I think, is the other empires around. So for example, were they careful to shield the knowledge created by the EIC from, for example, Dutch East India Company, or were they very keen to get in touch and exchange the knowledge? Because it's not intelligence or information. The knowledge then, I think, means something different from this development thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I'm going to deal with this in two ways. I think you see rivalry as well as collaboration between the different European East India companies. Obviously, there was especially a Dutch one, but also French and various other European commercial outfits in Asia. And you do see personnel moving between them, especially in the 18th century when the other European ones are a bit more active and the company hasn't overwhelmed them all. So you do see rivalry as well as collaboration. There's in times of war, of course, the collaboration becomes much harder. So in the 7 Years' War, there's not a lot of collaboration, at least not intentionally. And similarly in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And now when it comes to the ideas about knowledge, which again are really the heart of my book, that is, I think, an open question and one I'd like to see explored by others. This is, to my knowledge, the first study of ideas about knowledge, study of ideological debates around knowledge and the terms in which they were actually waged. And so I would be really fascinated to find if scholars of the Dutch East India Company and European rivals, as well as other successor states, indigenous successor states in India and beyond, in Asia and elsewhere, whether they were having similar discussions, whether this idea of conciliation has any resonances elsewhere. I would bet, however, that mass education certainly does. So I would venture strong guess that mass education is being discussed and carries a lot of ideological weight in the 1820s and 30s, not just in India, but elsewhere. I think the company is at the vanguard of those debates over education. I mean, Parliament in Britain doesn't authorize any money for education until much later than the company initially does. So it's really at the forefront of that movement towards mass education, in theory at least, not in practice.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I'm really excited about reading the book. I have two questions, that's okay. One, I think is sort of recently thinking about your work in relation to a scholar who you mentioned, Phil Stern. And I guess sort of asking you to reflect on this claim that, with Hastings, something kind of radically new is happening. The conciliation is something radically new. I guess thinking along Stern's lines, you get friends of companies sovereignty over much less territorial expanded areas from the late 17th century onwards. Is there, what are the kind of policies and knowledge associated with that? Are there precursors to a type of conciliation that's taking place within Madras around the 18th century, say? Or, it's just a very radically departure within Hastings. And I think that the second question kind of follows on from some other questions with those aims of conciliation. And simply is, how does this look in other presidencies at the same time? Is conciliation kind of an active category of interrogation in Bombay and Madras, and I suppose in any other locales? Yeah, thanks once again.
Yeah, thanks. Both questions very worth thinking about. I think here's where the 17th century historians are going to jump up and yell and wave their hands and tell me I've got it all wrong, and many important things were happening in the 17th century. I think what's different with Hastings is really the scale of activity. He's doing this scholarly patronage on a much bigger scale, and he's making much more hay of it politically. He's, I think, making it much more central to his political philosophy, if we can call it something that's systematic. And I don't find traces of that in the past. So you do have the companies sponsoring science, the humanities, books from an early date. And no doubt this is partly to burnish their image. But I don't see something as worked up as a system, which is what Hastings explicitly calls his system of conciliation. I don't see something like that happening until then. And anything I've seen, but especially in the 17th century, I wonder, in fact, what they will say about this book, and I hope they do discuss it and challenge it in interesting ways. So the second point, this idea does spread quickly from Hastings, especially once he gets over the hump of the impeachment and is lionized once again back in Britain. So the idea is adopted elsewhere. You see already at the end of his administration in Madras, they hire a naturalist, official naturalist, and they found an observatory. So you see these things happening already in the later period of his governor generalship, and I think really especially in the 1790s. We have to remember, of course, that Bengal was by far the biggest presidency at this time. The most civil servants were going there, the most army officials to officers. And so Madras was kind of the junior partner, and Bombay was really just a tiny little place at this moment. They become much more important in the 19th century. And we see them crop up in the story a lot in the 1820s and 30s, when all these presidencies and the strait settlements in Southeast Asia are debating questions of education and not taking the lead from Bengal by any means.
There's a question just, yeah, can you put your hand up? Yeah. No? Okay. Well, can I come to the person behind and then to you in front?
Thanks, George. So looking forward to reading the book now. That's a few examples. So my question is, like, as difficult it is to unpack knowledge as a category, I also wanted to know, I mean, there are certain kind of balances you would see, right? Once the knowledge, which is kind of transgressive, if you want to use epistemic violence kind of a thing, like it's topographic knowledge that they're after the Eastern Company, it's cadastral, it's botanical, and so on. So all empires are vying for the same set of knowledge practices, but there's also something slightly different, perhaps, but at the same time aligned to it at play, and that is the politics of translation, right? So I'm thinking of like all these modes of translations of philological kind of linguistic works. So not just the vernacular one, not Persian to English and so on, but also something like Principia Mathematica by Newton, right, which gets translated in Calcutta from Arabic. So when it's actually intention, how does it play out, not just our common books, but also at the geological level?
Well, I think you bring up another, we've heard one kind of very sensible way of distinguishing between different kinds of knowledge. You've raised another one. And I think, again, shockingly, the company keeps bundling them back up together. It keeps finding recourse to this incredibly broad category of knowledge. And it's surprising for many of the reasons you just gave, that there's something quite different about going out and surveying on the one hand, and then on the other hand, translating a work of Sanskrit or whatever. Amazingly though, and partly because disciplines have not really separated into their modern university lines yet, a lot of the same people are active on all of these fronts. So the surveys, well, we might imagine that they're out gathering topographic data and mapping in a kind of mathematical way. They're also collecting manuscripts, interviewing local scholars and headmen. The most well-known example is Colin Mackenzie, who I showed an illustration earlier, who is not simply taking the measure of the landscape and seeing how much territory the company has acquired, but picking up manuscripts and building this huge scheme to digest and compile them, which he never finishes due to a lack of patronage by that time. So I think for all the ways that knowledge seems to us very different, and it seemed to people at the time different along some of the same lines, all of these ways kept being bundled up into big ideologies around knowledge by the company and even largely by its interlocutors. So you have certainly debates emerging over what's the most valuable use of limited resources, which kind of knowledge projects should be sponsored. We do see this. But the category itself remains somehow whole. And this surprised me as much as it might surprise you to hear.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the very inspiring and well-organized talk. I learned a lot from there. So I have a question about the transition, because you mentioned they finally focus on the mass education, right? So I want to know what kind of the relationship between this transition with the position of EIC during the this period, because we know in the period you talk about the EIC, it changed a lot. So I want to know this relationship.
Yeah, thanks for that very excellent question. Translation was a big part of almost everything the company did because they were constantly encountering new languages. Everybody knows so many languages in India and Southeast Asia more broadly. And it was a part of bigger projects. So to work on natural specimens and natural history, you had to figure out if there was a European term already for the thing that you found and talk to local gatherers of specimens and medicine men who might have worked with the things and had terms for them, just to give one among many examples. Language was always coming into the picture. And a lot of the training at the company's colleges was linguistic. There was, of course, a practical need for this. But I think it also, linguistic knowledge gets bundled up with all these other kinds and big statements about the value of knowledge politically. I think the most dramatic example of this, and I can probably give many, but is the College of Fort William, which sets up language departments, not only in the ones you'd expect, not only Bengali and Persian and Arabic, but in collaboration with some of the local missionaries at Serampore, just upriver. It gets going, translating into dozens, scores of different languages from all over the wider region. And so language is constantly a part of these knowledge activities. I think where I might diverge from some other scholars is not seeing a particular importance to linguistic as opposed to other kinds of scholarship. I don't think that ideologically learning languages played a bigger role, for instance, than gathering natural history specimens or nautical charts or something. I think all of this fed into the same very broad way that people thought about knowledge politically at the time. And the debates were not so much over language. That's my difference with the major interpretation of the Anglicist Orientalist controversy. I don't really think it was about language.
I think probably we have time for one last question. Should anybody like to fill that slot? Is there anyone who still would like to ask a question? If not,
Well,
Yeah,
if
come on.
if I may,
yeah, please do. We've got
So it all comes to an end in the 1830s. But then SOAS is instituted in London, which is clearly about serving the colonial project. What's the relationship? How do we get from Macaulay to SOAS?
Well, thinking back to when I read about this, I see it this way, that by the 1820s and 30s, you have a whole host of institutions like the Royal Asiatic Society being set up and London College being set up, which are competitors with the East India Company, which before then was the main, maybe the sole conduit of knowledge about Asia back to Europe. Certainly, okay, it's not the sole one, but it's the major one, and certainly in its own mind. But as it starts to give up that role, you see this host of other institutions and a much more decentralized gathering and sponsoring of knowledge happening in London and beyond. Similarly, while for a time, the East India Company's museum and its headquarters in London was really the gathering point for all specialists in Europe on Asia, that really is not true by the 1820s and 30s. The directors have let the museum really fall down, and you see other collections sprouting up in places that are more accommodating to the scholars donating them. So you do see this more decentralized picture of Orientalist scholarship in Britain by the 1820s and 30s. This translates to all the new universities that sprout up in the following decades.
well on that point. I think yes, we can bring the formal part of this evening to an end. You know, as it says on the screen, Josh, thank you very much for please, I'm sure still there is hospitality will be shared and